will be on the subject of achieving justice, war crimes, religious persecution, and historical memory. And I'm just going to ask for your attention, please, as I introduce a woman who needs no introduction, who is very, very dear to all of us here, Marta Farion. Marta is, Marta is on the board of the Ukrainian Congress Committee, Illinois Division. She is the president of the Kyiv Mohila Foundation of America. She's the vice president of the Ukrainian World Congress. She is in so many ways like a godmother to all of us in this community. She is a person to turn to for advice, for wisdom, for mentorship. Our dear friend and leader, Marta Farion.
Thank you, Marko. I'd like to be called a godmother. Well, I think that after lunch, everyone is relaxed and we're ready to roll. But before we start with our panel, we are going to ask the rest of the panelists to come up. But before we start, I wanted to mention that this entire event would not have happened without the leadership, the vision, the dynamism, the stubbornness and vision of a particular person. When she first told us about her idea, we said, no, it's too much work, it's impossible, it's not going to work. But she made it happen. And how she does this, being a doctor with patients and working full time with patients, and then at night staying up till midnight and 2 o'clock in the morning and every weekend to work on our Ukrainian matters. Just unbelievable, and congratulations on hosting and organizing and managing such an event. Dr. Maria Dmitriuk, thank you. So now we have a panel that is going to be more dedicated to very, very rough topics, because we're talking about justice, war crimes, persecution, historical memory, and it is my honor to welcome our distinguished panelists. In recent months, international media coverage of Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine focused largely on efforts to broker peace. However, during recent meetings in Alaska and Washington, and immediately after the meetings, Russia continued its relentless bombing of Ukraine's civil population and pressed forward with its land grabs. We did not hear about the suffering of those living under occupation or across the cities that were being bombed. War crimes and crimes against humanity are committed daily by Russia, but they are not part of the discussion. Everybody talks about land swaps, land, but what is land? It's the people who live there and suffer. Missile and drone attacks are only a fraction of Russia's crimes. Efforts to hold Russia legally accountable have been insufficient. If the cycle of Russian impunity is to end, justice for victims and survivors and accountability for aggressors are essential. The scale and gravity of these crimes defy imagination. Since the full-scale invasion in 2022, more than 156,000 war crimes investigations have been opened in Ukraine. And as of March of this year, only 150 verdicts were reached. Nearly 20,000 Ukrainian children have been forcibly transferred to Russian-occupied areas. No, Russia, to Russia. In March 2023, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Russian President Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova for their role in the abduction of children. Under the Rome Statute, which was established in 1998, 125 countries recognize its jurisdiction. In other words, Putin can't go to any of those countries because he'll get arrested. Putin risks getting arrested in all those nations, however, because the United States does not recognize the ICC because of concerns that American soldiers could be targeted for various atrocities. Think of Vietnam, for example. Putin was welcomed in Alaska without fear of arrest. This dimension receives very little media attention. The fact that he was able to come to the United States, rolled with a red carpet rolled out, and he was not arrested. It's a question that should be posed everywhere. And of course, the red carpet, now in Ukraine, there are songs, new songs and new poems about how the red carpet symbolizes the blood of Ukrainians. To understand these crimes from a legal perspective, it is important to distinguish the categories. We talked about education several times. That word came up several times today. And of course, I'm very convinced that it is education that will be responsible for any real changes in the world. It is education that prevents people from being manipulated. And Ukrainians do have a good education. And that's why Ukrainians are tops in technology, with drones, with artificial intelligence. It is education that they received that allows them to do that. So there are teams of legal specialists, attorneys in Ukraine and other countries working on these cases. There are teams from Ukrainian law schools that are working together with teams from US law schools, precisely on the issues of war crimes. So let me just, a bit of education just to let you know about the definitions of what we're dealing with and how difficult it is to get any judgments. So there's crime against aggression includes the unlawful deportation and transfer of populations, particularly children. And that's the crime that Putin was accused for, and that's why there is an arrest warrant on him. There are war crimes included with violations of the laws of war during armed conflict, the mistreatment or killing of prisoners of war, and other crimes. There are crimes against humanity that include a widespread or systematic attacks against civilians in wartime or in peacetime, such as the atrocities in Bucha or Mariupol, or the persecution of churches and pastors in occupied areas. And there is the crime of genocide, that are acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. I'm sure you identify that Russia is guilty of all of these. These definitions were established during the Nuremberg trials. Up to that time, there were no such categories. It had to be created then in order to win cases against the top Nazis in Nuremberg. These are difficult but necessary topics. And in this context, it is my privilege and honor to introduce our distinguished panelists. And we will start with Adrian Karatnycky, a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and co-director of the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter. From 1993 to 2004, he was president and executive director of Freedom House. I remember that very well. He was very, very active, where he developed programs of assistance to democratic and human rights movements in Belarus, Serbia, Russia, and Ukraine. For 12 years in Freedom House, he devised a range of long-term comparative analytic surveys of democracy and political reform, and was co-editor of the annual Nations in Transit study. He is a contributor to Foreign Affairs, Newsweek, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, National Review, The Atlantic, and many other periodicals, and co-authored 3 books and co-editor of 8 books on Soviet and post-Soviet themes. And his latest book, which I ordered immediately and read it immediately when it came out a few months ago, Battleground Ukraine. And this book will be available for purchase when you leave after our event. I highly recommend it because we can identify with it. There are so many names of people we know that you will read it like a novel. So, without any further ado, I would like to ask Adrian to take over, and it is a privilege to have you, and it's fun to have you in Chicago. We've been friends for many years, and I'm thrilled that you were able to make it. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta, and thank you to the organizers for having assembled such an impressive group of community activists and voices for Ukraine in the United States. And thank you for the privilege of being part of a distinguished panel of people who have made outstanding contributions in the interests of Ukraine and its legitimate rights. Let me talk a little bit about this moment. I think we're in a moment where we see a kind of a disarray in what we call international system of adherence to international norms and laws. Russia is a renegade state that is continuing since 2014 to break a precedent that has existed had existed for 8 decades since the end of the Second World War. Russia is the first country to have, by force, not in response to an external aggression, taken the territory of another country, waged a war in the taking of a territory of another country, and then annexed that territory. There is no other example. The only semi-examples are Israel in the Golan Heights, where Israel was responding to an attack on its territories. So that is not an example because it was a response, not an outright aggression. The second example was Iraq annexing Kuwait, which was reversed by the action of the international community. And Tibet, when China took Tibet, Tibet was only recognized by 2 nations. It was not a member state of the United Nations. It was de facto independent, but it was not a recognized entity in the eyes of the international community. This is the first time where the recognized territory of an international community has been taken by force and then annexed. This is a direct attack on the entire post-war system of peace and security, and that is something, unfortunately, that our president and our leaders in Washington seem to be signaling that they are willing to settle and accept, and give Russia a pass on this violation. But we've seen everywhere the violation of standards. We've seen everywhere a kind of coarsening or of ignoring of kind of fundamental principles and fundamental values. But I don't believe it actually matters. What I think matters is what is going on and what the Ukrainian people are doing. Let me take you to our own experience as Americans. In the 1950s and 60s, a large portion of our population was semi-disenfranchised, completely disenfranchised, second-class citizens, and mistreated, discriminated against, and so on. And then a broad civil rights movement emerged that appealed in its actions and in its courage the African Americans and their allies in the Jewish and the civil rights communities. They created a coalition of conscience that turned the country around on this fundamental issue and allowed us to make the great progress that our country has made over the last decades. Ukrainians are bearing that cross today. Ukrainians are reminding a world that is looking away from standards and rights and actually giving them real meaning. Ukrainians are fighting for these values of the post-war order of respect for national and territorial sovereignty, of respect for human rights, of respect for human dignity, of respect for human choice and the protection of cultures. They're doing it in this amazing display of courage, of national unity, and we are the broader community that is helping them to engage. And I know there's a lot of pessimism abroad, but I believe that a true cause girded by people of immense courage and immense moral purpose will eventually prevail and will turn the tide on some of these temporary and unfortunate trends. In the end, international law will not be secured by people sitting in The Hague. It will be secured on the battlefields of Ukraine. It'll be secured on the debates that we hold in the United States and in the democratic world, and on the ability of all of us, including Europe, to show a greater kind of a militance and commitment to fundamental values. But Ukraine is really leading the way, and Ukraine is breaking through to the consciences of the world. We also have to understand that in our country we have people with very differing views. For example, among many people on the right, there is a skepticism about, quote, international law. But there isn't a skepticism about the rights that international law is supposed to uphold. And we can appeal to people from the religious right, we can appeal to conservative nationalists on the idea of the fact that there are natural God-given rights that derive of what we are as human beings. We have to find different ways of talking to different constituencies. We have to be tolerant of those differing views, and we also have to lay out the facts. We've seen the impact of the story that's been told and documented of the abduction of children. That transcends any official standards, views on which international system of rights works, or whether this is, countries are responsible for their own rights, et cetera, et cetera. It breaks through into people's hearts. And Ukraine has found some ways of doing it, and we, in the diaspora and Friends of Ukraine, have to continue to find ways of doing it. The second way that I think we need to appeal. Not everyone, there are people here who have liberal views, centrist views, very conservative views. We have to appeal to the conservative nationalists who are also a part of that, the Republican universe. Ukraine is fighting fundamentally for the very principle that conservative nationalists advocate. They advocate for the protection of your indigenous essence and of your, the values and the cultural heritage that you have been gifted by history. and by your ancestry. Ukrainians are laying down their lives for this very principle. So what I would say is that in a period where there is a lot of upheaval on the application of standards, we simply have to find different ways of appealing using different instruments. Yes, the International Criminal Court in terms of indictments, but yes, if people don't go that far or are hostile to it, we have to appeal to them in different ways. So we have to be very sophisticated, we have to be very broad-based in how we work. And the reason that I think we have to try all these things is we have to buy time for Ukraine. We have to buy time to win more support for Ukraine. But I think Ukrainians are doing the heavy lifting for all of us, and they're also the source of our inspiration, because they're really embodying all those things that we grew up with, you know, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and so on. Those are, in essence, what Ukrainians are fighting for. They're fighting for the right to be, you know, masters of their own homes, of their own views, of their own judgments, of their own values. And I think that that is something that we continue to go to the rest of the world with, and I think we will continue to find allies. And whatever you may think of this given moment, however bleak it may seem, the fact that Ukraine is standing and holding Russia to a standstill is showing immense civic courage and immense civic unity. I think that is a sign that just as the civil rights movement turned this country around, Ukraine is turning and will turn the world in its favor and in the favor of its democracy and independence.
Thank you, Adrian, and thank you for bringing up the fact that we need to expand our role as Ukrainian Americans. We need to stop living strictly in a bubble. And how do Americans know us? They know us because we sing, we dance, we have the most beautiful embroideries, we have our culture that is the bright star of the Ukrainian community. But we also need to be politically engaged. And when there is a united Ukrainian-American community that stands for Ukraine, it means a lot, and politicians will notice. Not only that, we have the Polish-American community, the Baltic community, the Central European communities, and we must go out and organize together. And then it will make a difference. But I think it already made a difference. So on that note, I would like to ask an unusual, unbelievable person, Oleksandra Matviichuk, who, as you know, is the laureate of the Nobel Peace Prize for Peace. And she has been traveling throughout the world, promoting Ukraine, but promoting the idea of having the children that were stolen, to have them released. And she has brought Ukraine into the limelight at the highest levels, from kings and queens and presidents and the UN and everywhere. Oleksandra Matviichuk has been a real treasure for Ukraine. And I'll never forget, I met her in 2014 in Washington, D.C., right after the start of this assault, when everyone was really shocked, and she came to Washington with her colleagues to advocate Ukraine in Congress. And immediately, when I saw her after 10 minutes of hearing her speak, I said, this woman is going places. She is extraordinary, and it is a great pleasure to introduce her online. We thank her for joining us.
Thank you very much for providing me a floor. It's a huge honor for me to address to this distinguished audience. I would like to focus in my remarks on several things. And first is what this war is about. Because this is not a war just about territories. First and foremost, this is a war about freedom in all senses. A freedom to be an independent country, but not Russian colony, a freedom to have our own democratic choice, and a freedom to preserve Ukrainian identity and not to be forced to educate Ukrainian children as Russians. And in this point, this war has a genocidal character. Putin openly says there is no Ukrainian nation, there is no Ukrainian language, there is no Ukrainian culture. For 11 years, we have been documenting how these words converted in horrible practice. When Russian troops physically exterminate active local people on the ground, mayors, journalists, children writers, musicians, teachers, priests, environmentalists, how they ban Ukrainian language and culture, how they robbed and destroyed Ukrainian cultural heritage. And when they take Ukrainian children to Russia, they put them in Russian education camps. They told them they're not Ukrainian, they're Russian children, and their families, their parents refused from them, and they will be adopted by Russian families who will bring them up as Russians. As a lawyer, I know that genocide is a crime of crimes. It's very difficult to prove it, but there is no necessity to be a lawyer to understand a very common thing. If you want, partially or completely, to destroy some national group, there is no necessity to kill all representatives. You can just forcibly change their identity, and entire national group, sooner or later, will disappear. Second thing which I want to focus in my speech, it's about truth as a first victim of the war. I know that people start to understand that the war is going on only when bombs falling to their heads. But war has not just military, but also informational dimension. This is a battle for hearts and minds of people, and this battle has no limitation in national borders. Because the way how people see the world define their decision and actions, and that is why Russia attacked the truth. Russia invests heavily in its informational infrastructure, including Russian channels that broadcast in different languages, the troll factory, and thousands of bloggers catering to different taste and audience. Russia is trying hard to destroy our connection with reality. Russia refers to the war as a special military operation, justify attack on residential buildings, schools, hospitals, churches, and playgrounds as protection of Russian-speaking people, and portrays the abduction of Ukrainian children and their trafficking to Russia as their rescue. I see it even in my human rights work. I interviewed a young woman from Donetsk. She was illegally abducted and severely tortured because she has pro-Ukrainian sympathy, which is normal for citizens of the country to have a sympathy to their country. So she told me that she begged not to beat her because she was pregnant. But she got an answer that you have pro-Ukrainian views, and that is why your child has no right to be born. But then later, the perpetrators changed their mind and told her, we will release you if you will say to Russian journalists that you are a sniper. For sure, she agreed. She can say that she is Batman. So she told this artificial story that she is a sniper to Russian journalists. And one detail struck me. When this Russian journalist arrived, they had no surprise with the whole situation. The only thing which they asked her to do, to sit in a pose to hide her pregnancy, because it's ruined the whole plot. And that is why we, as a human rights lawyer, built a national network of local documentators. We covered the whole country, including the occupied territories. We have an ambitious goal to document every criminal episode which was committed in the smallest village. We have in our database more than 88,000 episodes of war crimes, and this is already the most documented war in the human history. Third, I would like to tell about justice, because we provide this documentation for justice, not just for national archives. And justice is precondition to sustainable peace. All this hell which we face in Ukraine is a result of total impunity which Russia enjoyed for decades. Russian troops committed horrible crimes in Chechnya, in Moldova, in Georgia, in Mali, in Libya, in Syria, in other countries of the world. They have never been punished. They believe they can do whatever they want. We must break the circle of impunity. We must demonstrate justice. And last thing which I want to focus on, it's our historical responsibility. I, as a human rights lawyer, now found myself in a situation when the law doesn't work. I know pretty well the UN system, Council of Europe, OSCE, legal mechanisms, but I have no tools how to stop Russian atrocities. So I invest a lot of efforts to international advocacy, to meet with presidents of different countries, members of parliaments, members of governments, to convene them to help us to achieve justice. And what I see that all these people who take political decisions, at least majority of them, still look to the world through the lens of the Nuremberg trial. But Nuremberg trial, it was victorious trial. It was trial where Nazi war criminals were tried only after Nazi regime had collapsed. And past century, it was a very essential step to establish law and justice. But it also set this ethical standard that justice is privileged to winners. I would like to remind all of us that we live in a new century. We must move further. Justice is not privilege. Justice is the basic human rights. And a lot of things changed rapidly after the Second World War, after the Nuremberg trial. And that is why our historical responsibility to make justice independent on the fact when and how the war will end. This means that we cannot wait. We must establish all legal procedures now to hold Putin, top political leadership, and high military command of the Russian state accountable. And I know, being a lawyer, that international crimes has no statute of limitation. It means that even if today we have no geopolitical situation to hold them accountable, tomorrow, when the window of opportunity will open, we will do it. And we have to get everything ready for this window of opportunity. And that is why, to end in the positive note, I would like to remind that just a month ago, Council of Europe established a very important historical decision, which is revolutionary, because Council of Europe announced the creation of special tribunal on aggression to hold Putin and his surrounding accountable for the crime against peace. And all atrocities, all these 88,000 episodes, which me and my colleagues were documented, it's a result of the leadership decision to break the peace and to start the war. And we're just on the beginning on this path, the path which lead us to justice, but the first step has already taken. And I know, working with people affected by this war directly, that people who went through hell, they need to restore not just their broken life, broken families, broken vision of the future, but their broken belief that justice is possible, even though delayed in time. Thank you very much.
Oleksandra, thank you for finding the time to join us in Chicago. I know that your schedule is very, very packed. And on behalf of all of us, I want to thank you for the tremendous work you're doing in trying to reform the international laws so that the crimes committed by Russians in Ukraine, so that they can be brought to justice. Their impunity is just something that can no longer be tolerated. Thank you so much. Well, our next speaker is Volodymyr Viatrovych. I believe he is in Kyiv, and he's going to join us also online. Oh, there he is. There he is. So it is also a great pleasure to introduce Volodymyr Viatrovych online. I just want you to know he wasn't able to get a visa. He really wanted to be here. And Volodymyr is a historian, a civic activist, and a member of Ukraine's parliament for many years. From 2002 to 2010, he served as director of the Center for Research of Liberation Movements. And from 2008 to 2010, he headed the archives of the Security Service of Ukraine. Let me just break to explain that for a second. These are the KGB archives that were left after the Soviet Union fell apart. And he was in charge of them. And he spent a lot of time with a team going over all the documentation. Then in 2010, he was a senior visiting scholar at the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University. He is a member of the Board of Trustees of the National Museum Memorial of Victims of the Occupation Regimes, known as the Lonsky Prison in Lviv. This is a site of profound tragedy, where in 1941, my own mother and her friends went to search for the bodies of survivors, to identify the bodies of their loved ones and friends, after the NKVD, NKVD, the precursor of the KGB, massacred hundreds of Ukrainians in a single day before fleeing from the advancing German army. They just grabbed people and killed them if they were Ukrainian. I encourage all of you, if you're ever in Lviv, to visit this museum. There you will understand more deeply why Ukrainians are fighting today to defend their own existence and why Ukrainians will never, ever give up. So since 2019, Volodymyr has served as a member of parliament while continuing his prolific work as author of many, many books and articles. Volodymyr, it is a pleasure again to see you after many, many years, a long time ago when you came to Washington and we drove to New York and Philadelphia from Washington with Boris Potapenko, and we listened to rock music. Those were the days, how everything has changed. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for invitation. Thank you for organizing this very important conference. I speak to you from the little town Worzel. It's near Bucha, which has become symbol of Russian crimes. My house also was under occupation. In this panel, we will talk about two different but connected topics: war crimes and historical national memory. Winners are not judged. This is the idea Putin is trying to make real today. Because if he wins the war, he will have the power to rewrite its history. And then he can conceal his own crimes. Stalin did the same. He never faced responsibility for his crimes before, during, and after Second World War. Why? Because he was among the victors over Nazism. Putin has already repeated this with Georgia. The local pro-Russian government erases the memory of Russian aggression in 2008. They wipe it from public consciousness. This helps them stay in power. Russian propaganda spreads its message to entire world. It is not clear who started the war in Ukraine, and it does so quite effectively. Even the president of United States once called Ukraine fight for freedom senseless war. He suggested that Ukrainians could end the war easily. Yes, they could, but only by agreeing to capitulation, by forgetting what a Russian victory means. It means brutal occupation, it means mass repression, destruction of Ukrainian culture, it means genocide. We know this from the terrible lessons of 20th century. And we see it again in today's war, in Bucha, in Mariupol, in Izium, and countless other places where the Russian army has come. That is why the memory of what Russia means for Ukrainians is not only about honoring the dead. It is also about protecting ourselves from future crimes. That is why it's so important to document Russian crimes today, to speak about them, and to remind the world about the crimes of the past. In this way, we preserve not only ourselves, we also protect the world. Russia does not aim to take only part of Ukraine. It wants to control whole country. To do this, it must change the identity of Ukrainians. That's why this is war for identity. Russia wants to change how Ukrainians see their parts. It wants to convince them that Ukrainians and Russians are one people. It wants to destroy everyone who thinks differently. And it wants to erase everything that proves Ukrainians are a separate nation. That is why Russians destroy museums, destroy libraries. They bring their own history teachers into Ukraine. They ban the Ukrainian language in the occupied territories. This is why it is important for Ukrainians to protect their national memory, because national memory is one of bases of national identity. By the way, this week the Ukrainian parliament passed an important law. It is the law of national memory policy. It says that strengthening national identity is a key part of national security for Ukraine. It also give an official name to this war, the war for independence, because independence is what we defend in this war, and independence is exactly what Russia wants to take away from Ukrainians. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Volodymyr. You just reminded me that people, Americans usually say, how can people be killed or arrested, put in prison just because they speak Ukrainian? But it is a fact because the language is part of the identity, and I would like to share a story about that. Not from the old times, but something that happened in the last few years. There is a woman, PhD professor, who was prorector, which is vice president of the Donetsk National University. And of course, the occupation of Donetsk was particularly violent. If you remember how the airport in Donetsk was destroyed and how many people were killed. Anyways, she was a professor there. And when her village where she lived, her town was occupied, her next door neighbor went to the occupiers, to the Russian, officers that were there, and told them that she refuses to speak Russian, she speaks Ukrainian. So they immediately arrested her and they put her in prison in one of those famous basements. And you know what happens in those basements. Obviously, she was abused, but the Russian army is quite corrupt as well. And her husband found money to pay off her guards. So they let her out. She came home, and the next day, her next door neighbor again went to the authorities to say that she's still speaking Ukrainian. So they arrested her again. Long story short, her husband again found the money to pay off the captors, and at that time then they escaped and they went to the west, but they went to Kyiv, and of course you can imagine the trauma. But in any case, the president of Kyiv Mohyla Academy, Serhiy Kvit, invited her to become dean of a new faculty, the School of Adult Education, and also the Institute for the young people, the kids that wound up in Kyiv, escaping from their homes in the east. These are the kids that lost their parents and their homes, and this is what she's doing now. But this is just an example of somebody that was really abused and put in prison just for speaking Ukrainian. So now we are coming to our last, but not least, speaker, and it was my pleasure to meet Elina Beketova today. We never met before, and I was fascinated because I love Crimea, and it hurts me so much that it's no longer under Ukrainian laws, and it's occupied. And Elina was born in Crimea, and she is very active in the United States. She graduated from Kharkiv National University with a master's degree in clinical psychology, and from the Kyiv Institute of Modern Psychology and Psychotherapy. Elina is a distinguished fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington, where she authored numerous insightful articles on Ukraine and Eastern Europe. She's also a creator of Behind the Lines, a database and series of articles focused on Ukraine's temporarily occupied territories. And her articles appear in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, The Hill, Newsweek, BBC News, and many others. It is a great pleasure to welcome you in Chicago and our community.
Пані Марта, дякую дуже. Well, thank you so much. And at first, I just wanted to say thank you to the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, Illinois Division, personally to Pavlo and Maria, who got a chance to bring me from Mississippi, where I live right now. But originally, yes, I'm from Crimea, from the south in Ukraine. And I worked as a journalist there 20 years ago. I started my career there. Then I lived in the eastern part of Kharkiv and then in Kyiv. And last 3 years, I'm writing about temporarily occupied Ukrainian territories, and I try to explain to Americans and to the Western policy makers what the occupation means, because sometimes to people who have never gone through the occupation, they think, what's the problem with it? You know, like you live there, you're not killed, you're not injured or whatever, and not all people understand what those people who are staying in the temporarily occupied territories, what they are going through. And I have a couple of key points that I wanted to share with you, because I speak with people who are staying in the temporarily occupied territories, that occupation can be soft or aggressive, but neither means people support it. Many who remain in the temporarily occupied territories are not pro-Russian, as some people might think. For many people, they can't leave the territory because they basically have the property there, they have sick parents, or they simply cannot leave their home. And that's their right to stay there, even though the Ukrainian government are trying to tell, well, get out of there, we'll host you here, and then you will return when Ukraine regains control over it. But it's their choice to stay, and unfortunately they have to go through many challenges if they stay there. And many, if they stay there, unfortunately with time, they cannot leave these territories because of the filtration procedures that they exist these days. I would never say that we would be talking about this in the 21st century, but essentially it's Russian forces check the telephone, what they have there, and even the subscription on the Ukrainian news channel might be the reason to detain this person. Silencing as a crime, as we have heard here, it's the war on identity. And what Russian forces are doing there, they're trying to isolate these regions from the rest of Ukraine. And people living there, they are afraid to talk with people, to people who are staying on the Ukraine-controlled territory, because sometimes even speaking to these people can be labeled as spying, espionage, and other false charges. You know, once I was, that's a typical situation when I try to talk with a person from the temporarily occupied territory. They speak with me, and then they ask me not to publish it. So they just want someone to learn about what they are going through, but they don't want it to be published because they are afraid. Because they are afraid that, you know, someone will come to them and they will detain them. Because this is their reality, unfortunately. And this is what Russian forces are doing with their identities. It's basically intimidation, and people have to live in this feeling of the fear constantly. You know, I was speaking with a person, I met her in DC, and she is originally from occupied part of Kherson region. She still has some friends of the friends over there, and she told me that they, so sometimes they speak, like they have video chats, and they ask her not to be on the background with the Ukrainian flag, because they were afraid that someone will tell that they saw these people speaking with someone with the Ukrainian flag. This is the level of intimidation that exists on the temporarily occupied territories, and I just wanted to share it with you because not all people know what those people staying there are going through, and not all of them are pro-Russian, and many of them are afraid to speak, and many of them unfortunately have this trauma, and they don't integrate it unless they leave this territory. And that's the process. You know, I think I've integrated my personal trauma only when I was in the United States. Before, I was being still traumatized, and I had my level of PTSD. But you don't think about it when you are in it. And only when you get out and when you have the feeling of freedom, if you live on Ukraine-controlled territory or elsewhere, not on the occupied territory, then you can integrate the trauma that you have had. Currently, and the third point that is very important, civilians must be part of all type of negotiations that we hear about right now, because we have 20,000 abducted kids. We have around 16,000 Ukrainian civilians that are held in Russian captivity, and only 168 have been freed, but that's the data as of December 2024. And the reason is simple, because there are no legal mechanisms to release civilians, because for that Ukraine had to take Russian civilians, and then there would be swaps, but Ukraine is a democratic country. So that is why, and also as representatives in the coordination headquarters for the treatment of prisoners of war say, that in some cases Russians don't admit that they have this person, or distort and deliberately speculate about their status. So when Ukrainians reach out and ask about this particular person, they say that it's not a Ukrainian citizen, because according to their laws, they basically change, and that this is like the Russian citizens for them, or they change their names, the same as with the abducted children. You know the stories, when they adopt and they put them into the Russian families, they just change their names, last names. It's not Ukrainian citizens, allegedly. There are currently around 29 journalists that are detained on false charges, and you all heard the case of Victoria Roshina, the Ukrainian journalist who was detained in the occupied part of Ukraine, and she was tortured, and she died in the captivity, in the Russian captivity, and her parents couldn't get her body for many, many months. That's the reality in the temporarily occupied territories. And right now we have around 29 Ukrainian journalists who are still in the captivity. And, basically we understand that, there are Irina Danilovich, Dmytro Chyliuk, Sergei Tsighipa, Irina Levchenko, and many other Ukrainian journalists who even stopped their journalism and stopped their work when they lived in the temporarily occupied territories, but they were still detained for being journalists, or for being detained on false charges, because Russians usually detain people with active pro-Ukrainian position, who are activists, who are teachers, professors, people who can educate other people, so they're afraid of them, so that is why they try to detain them the first. But that's the story that we have, and I could probably talk more about that, more about these cases, but as Oleksandra Matviichuk also said, they document these war crimes every day, and they unfortunately happen every day, I was particularly shocked when in the recent there was a recent swap, and Yulia Panina, Svetlana Holovan, Marina Bereznyanska, they were 6 years in captivity, and they were taken for everyday acts, driving a daughter to school, having relatives in free Ukraine, or being accused of SBU ties. But they reunited with their kids, and everything is okay. Another case that probably struck me the most, I was writing the story about Russian efforts and how they're trying to colonize Ukraine, and that they failed to do it. And I spoke with the person, she lives in Poland right now. During the first months of the full-scale invasion, her kid was with her parents in the temporarily occupied territory. I mean, that was not the temporarily occupied territory before the full-scale invasion, but it quickly became so, and she couldn't get to him. And then she said she tried to get her son after, so she was detained on the border. And she told me that they held me for 2.5 days, forced me to take a polygraph, and asked about weapons, drugs, whether the territory was occupied or liberated, how I felt about their special operation and the Azov battalion. So she couldn't make it, so the whole time she had no food, water, and slept on a metal chair. She was forced, they basically told her that they would put her in a prison. She had to come back to Poland. She didn't make it. She didn't take her son back. She then had to ask her mom, who stayed there, to ask for a special permission at the local occupying forces so that she could take her grandkid to Poland. But this is the reality, unfortunately. And just wanted to say something optimistic in the end, that despite all their efforts that they're trying to Russify the local population, and they're targeting the younger population, most of all. They have all the types of indoctrination programs. I write about it in Behind the Lines. There is a tracker. So if you just put there Russification or militarization, you will see all the militarization of education campaigns that they have there. There is a good news that 44,000 children stay online in study online in Ukrainian schools, and they are in temporarily occupied territories. And 12,000 students from temporarily occupied territories applied to Ukrainian universities this year. This is nearly double than last year, which means that despite all the Russification efforts, we have many thousands of Ukrainian kids and teenagers who want to tie their lives, who feel that they are Ukrainian, and Russians couldn't eliminate and erase their Ukrainian identity, and they still choose Ukraine. And that is why this is what I'm trying to explain here, why Ukrainians want to liberate all these territories, because this is the war on identity, and Ukrainians want to protect not only the territories, they want to protect who they are. And that is why I hope that there will be a moment, we don't know when, but we had very good examples when Ukrainians had enough weapons. We saw Kherson region, we saw Kharkiv region, they were liberated, and of course Kiev region in the beginning. So we hope that many people who don't have this opportunity, they will go back to the places they call home.
Thank you, Elina. Just like you mentioned, we don't want to end this panel on a very negative note. And the fact of the matter is that the more and the longer that this war and persecution goes on, the more Ukrainian people, especially young people, are united because they want freedom and democracy. They want to be part of the West and not be part of Russia with all their backward living conditions. So we are united, and in Ukraine as well. I have a few questions that I'd like to pose from the audience. What is your view of accountability for Russia, considering that the United States is sanctioning the ICC and countries such as Hungary are withdrawing from it? We know where Hungary stands, and it's complicated for the United States.
I am not a great proponent of international law. I do believe in the solidarity of democratic nations and the efforts of democratic nations to try to work together to use their influence and sometimes their force to help create justice and to help other nations in the struggle for justice. So I'm not an all-out defender. I think that there's a lot that is flawed with the ICC. We see it in its attitude, and again, I'll say something controversial to Israel. I think that it is potentially an abusive instrument, and it's really an instrument that has only been used effectively in a couple cases. Mainly it's focused on the third world, and I see it as an instrument of the developed world to kind of maintain some kind of discipline on its former colonies. So I'm not a big fan. I think that what will bring Russia to justice, if it is at all possible, will be the enduring independence of a coherent, large, democratic, sovereign Ukrainian state, at great cost to Russia, the continuation of some forms of sanctions until Russia comes to terms and punishes those guilty of war crimes. I just don't see an enforcement mechanism. No one's going to start, if there is a settlement of the war, a new war with Russia to capture its war criminals. I think we will have to live with this. And I think that the best hope is that over time, Russia itself will undergo some kind of an internal change. I don't see Putin ending up in The Hague, unfortunately, as much as I would love to see it. But I do think that documenting, using the rigorous standards that have been developed in what is called international law is important to the process. It lends there is a consensus among civilized nations and peoples about what constitutes, war crimes, what constitutes violation of fundamental rights. And so I'm not suggesting discarding all of these principles, treaties, conventions. But I'm a practical person. I just don't see how you'll be able to enforce it against a nuclear power that is not going to be fully defeated. I mean, I think it will be, Ukraine will win, but Russia will not be defeated. Ukraine will win if it retains its identity, its democracy, and its territorial integrity, meaning the integrity of whatever territory it has control over. But I don't see any mechanism towards bringing these people ultimately to justice other than some kind of a shift in the internal temperature in Russia.
Thank you. It's not very encouraging to know that there's not going to be justice and fairness, and Ukraine must fight. There's another question here that I think is very interesting. Please explain the process of population replacement being done by Russia in the occupied territories. Is it similar to 1932-33? How is this being done?
This is a great question, and this is what exactly they're doing, because they're trying to squeeze out the Ukrainian population, and we see it everywhere, especially in well-documented cities as Mariupol, where they basically bring a lot of Russian citizens there. We saw it in Crimea. They, I think before the illegal annexation, there was around 3 million people. They substituted and they brought around 1 million of Russian citizens to the peninsula. This is their strategies. They offer mortgages, cheap mortgages to teachers, doctors, coaches. Their last strategy is to bring veterans of the special military operation of the war to the temporarily occupied territory and to give them 2% mortgages, so they're able to get the cheap house or apartment. Local people living in the temporarily occupied territories cannot apply for this program. It's only FSB officers, veterans, teachers, doctors from mainland of Russia can do that. So this is what they're doing. They're offering many incentives, and this is what it's one of their programs that they have. Another one they're trying, like one of their strategy is to erase the Ukrainian identity. I told you that they're targeting the younger population, so they have so-called university shifts. They take kids and teenagers from temporarily occupied Kherson, Zaporizhia, and other territories, and they bring them to Russia, to their universities. They have the connection with the teenagers from Russia so that they could enter the Russian universities. This is what they're doing. They're trying to squeeze out the local population from these territories and bring their Russians. But look, I've shared this last number. That's the Ukrainian human rights group Almenda, and they also track this in temporarily occupied territories, that kids still study online because Ukrainian schools do offer the online education for kids, so that they were able to pass the exams to enter the Ukrainian university. And I think this is the victory. This is already the victory of Ukraine, because teenagers feel themselves Ukrainians.
Thank you. And the same is being done by teenagers and young people in Western, in the United States, in Canada, and in Europe, the refugees. They are taking this entrance exam for universities in Ukraine. And this is a great program, and we've administered this program here in Chicago. There are many, many young people that have applied to Ukrainian universities. So thank God that there's online learning, and they also plan to go back to those universities. So this is just a sign of Ukrainians never giving up, and it's going to continue. So thank you very much. And